The summer of 1968 arrived at the small coastal village of Seaview with the golden warmth of the sun and the gentle whisper of the waves. It was a place where time seemed to flow more slowly, a refuge for those seeking monotony or peace. Claire Hathaway, a young music teacher, had lived there long enough to know every familiar rhythm of its routine. Her days were filled with teaching local children and spending solitary moments at the piano, attempting to express something even she couldn't name. Though known for her gentle and reserved demeanor, there was a quiet restlessness within Claire that words could never capture. On a busy morning in the market, Claire was startled by something unusual. A stranger had arrived in the village, and his demeanor contrasted sharply with the usual calm. He didn't seem interested in buying or chatting with the locals, but moved among the stalls with a camera in hand, capturing scenes with a mysterious purpose. Tall and lean, with a casual air, his eyes scanned every detail as if searching for something hidden. Claire found herself observing him from a distance, intrigued by how he seemed to find something extraordinary in a place that, to her, was just another ordinary day. Their encounter happened hours later, at a place Claire considered her secret refuge, the old piano abandoned on the pier. It was there that she would sit and play melodies for no one but the sea and the wind. That afternoon, as her hands moved over the worn keys, the stranger appeared again. He didn't interrupt her but stood at a distance, his camera pointed not just at the piano, but at her focused expression. When Claire noticed him, she hesitated, feeling vulnerable under the curious gaze of someone who seemed to see beyond the obvious. He wasn't intrusive, and somehow, that disarmed her. There was an almost respectful way he observed her, as if he recognized the intimacy of the moment. Even so, Claire left quickly, carrying with her a mix of curiosity and discomfort. It wasn't common for an outsider to stir so much interest in the village, let alone in her carefully constructed routine. That night, as she looked out the window of her small cottage, the memory of the man and his camera lingered in her mind, like a melody she couldn't forget. In the days that followed, Claire learned through whispers and rumors that he was an itinerant photographer, Victor Morrison, known for capturing the essence of small and forgotten places. He had arrived unannounced and seemed fascinated by Seaview, dedicating himself to photographing scenes the villagers considered mundane. Claire wondered what he saw there that she, having lived there for years, had never noticed. That curiosity began to grow into something more, a desire to understand what drew him to the village. What Claire didn't know was that Victor had also noticed something in her, something that intrigued him as much as the village itself. In his photographs, she wasn't just a figure. She was the living heart of a place that might otherwise seem unremarkable. He saw in Claire a story yet to be told, something perhaps even she hadn't recognized. There was a silent connection between them, a meeting of gazes and moments that hinted at changes neither of them could foresee. Thus, fate began to work quietly, weaving an invisible thread that connected Claire and Victor in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. Among the ebb and flow of the tides, something new was emerging, a feeling that defied time and place. But, as in all great stories, the road ahead was full of mysteries and choices that would lead them to discoveries as unexpected as they were inevitable. Fate, often working silently, seemed determined to bring Claire and Victor closer. 2 days after the encounter on the pier, Claire sat in a small village cafe, enjoying a break as she watched the quiet streets. It was a moment she cherished, a time to detach from expectations and lose herself in thought. However, her calm was interrupted when Victor walked through the cafe door, carrying his camera as if it were an extension of himself. He didn't see her immediately, But Claire felt an unexpected urge to speak to him, an urge that surprised her. The hesitation that usually held her back was replaced by a sudden courage. Claire stood and introduced herself simply, with a smile that revealed her curiosity. Victor seemed surprised but soon smiled back, recognizing her from the pier. The conversation that followed was brief and casual, but it carried a lightness Claire rarely experienced. He spoke of his passion for photographing small villages and finding beauty in places others overlooked. Claire, in turn, shared discreet details of her life, but maintained an air of mystery, as if protecting something he wasn't yet allowed to see. Later that afternoon, Victor made an unexpected suggestion. He asked if Claire would accompany him on a walk through the village, showing him the corners she found most special. The idea intrigued her. Though she knew Seaview better than anyone, she'd never considered seeing it through someone else's eyes. Reluctantly, but curious, Claire agreed, not realizing that this simple act would be the first step toward transforming her view of the world and herself. The walk began through narrow, flower-lined streets where Victor frequently stopped to capture details Claire had never noticed. It was as if he saw stories in every window, every shadow cast by the afternoon sun. As they walked, Claire began to feel something unusual, a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. She laughed spontaneously, asked questions, and listened intently to his answers. Gradually, she grew more comfortable in Victor's presence, as though he had the power to untangle the knots holding her back. When they reached the top of a hill, where an old windmill still stood against the wind, Victor suggested they rest. Claire admired the view as Victor adjusted his camera, but instead of photographing the horizon, he turned the lens toward her. Startled, Claire looked away, but Victor gently insisted, saying he wanted to capture what he saw in that moment. It was unsettling for Claire to be the focus of someone so perceptive, yet there was something comforting in his gesture. For a brief moment she felt truly seen. Hours passed like minutes, and as the sun began to set, Claire realized she didn't want the day to end. For the first time in years, she felt alive in a way that music and teaching had never provided. Victor, in turn, seemed equally captivated by her company, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't tire of trying to solve. Between them, a subtle connection formed, not through spoken words, but through the quiet moments they shared. When they finally parted that evening, Claire felt an unfamiliar emptiness. What had started as a simple walk through the village now seemed like the beginning of something much greater. Fate, she thought, had begun writing a story that neither of them could predict. As Victor disappeared into the night, Claire realized his presence had awakened something in her heart that she could no longer ignore. The days following that walk with Victor brought Claire a restless sense of anticipation. Each morning felt charged with promises, as if something was about to happen. She often saw him in the village, always with his camera, but never in a planned way. Their meetings seemed like mere coincidences, or so Claire liked to believe. Yet there was an undeniable pull between them, as if they were threads being drawn together by an invisible force. One particularly clear afternoon, Victor invited Claire to join him for a walk to the beach. It was a simple proposal, but Claire hesitated before accepting. The beach was outside the usual paths of the village, a place few ventured. However, there was something in the way he looked at her, as if he saw a part of her she didn't yet know, that made her agree. They walked side by side, mostly in silence, listening only to the sound of the wind and the waves gently breaking along the shore. When they reached the beach, Victor found a driftwood log for them to sit on, and there, under a golden sky, their conversation deepened. He began to speak of his life with a disarming honesty, He told her about the tragedy that had shaped his journey, the death of his sister years ago, which had driven him to leave everything behind in search of meaning he'd never found. Photography, he said, became his way of capturing fragments of beauty life still offered, even amidst sorrow. Claire listened intently, feeling both moved and exposed. His words struck a chord within her. For a moment, she considered sharing her own griefs, the choices that had trapped her in a life of conformity. But courage escaped her. Still, she found the strength to talk about her music, explaining how the piano was both a comfort and a constant reminder of her limitations. Victor, hearing this, replied simply, "Sometimes what we see as a limitation is really just a beginning." Those words stayed with Claire as the sun sank slowly into the horizon. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable but thick with meaning, as if no words were needed to convey their thoughts. Claire realized that Victor challenged her in ways no one else ever had. He didn't try to change her life or question her choices, but he made her question herself. Sitting there by the sea, she began to see parts of her soul that had never been touched before. As they walked back to the village, the sky now studded with stars, Claire felt as though she had left a part of herself on that beach, a vulnerability that both frightened and exhilarated her. Victor, on the other hand, seemed lighter, as if having her by his side had given him a new perspective on his own search. He said nothing as they walked, but his steady presence beside her was a quiet comfort. That night, as Claire gazed out the window of her cottage, her mind was filled with images: the sea, the setting sun, and Victor's gaze, which seemed to see something within her she didn't yet understand. For the first time in years, she felt on the brink of something new, as if the world was larger than she had imagined. Yet with hope came fear. What if this new beginning was something she couldn't reach? Or worse, what if it disappeared as quickly as it had come? The days following their visit to the beach were marked by a growing unrest within Claire. It was as if something had been awakened inside her, a distant echo of who she might have been, but had never dared to become. Victor remained a presence in her life, sometimes with chance encounters, other times with a simple wave as they crossed paths in the village. He never pressured her, yet his presence, both serene and intense, stirred a conflict she didn't know how to resolve. The village, with its usual calm, seemed unaware of the transformation taking place. To others, Claire remained the same gentle and reserved young woman, dedicated to her music lessons and preparing for her future marriage. But inside, the certainty she had once felt about her life was beginning to crumble. Victor wasn't just a man who had crossed her path. He was a mirror, reflecting parts of herself she had avoided facing. One quiet afternoon, Claire sat in her cottage, trying to focus on her sheet music. But the notes seemed to blur as thoughts of Victor filled her mind. His arrival had brought a breath of life into a world that had felt static for so long. Yet with it came guilt. She was engaged to a man who, while secure and respectable, had never stirred in her the emotions that now consumed her. The idea of betraying her family's expectations and society's plans for her life felt as terrifying as it was tempting. As Claire wrestled with her thoughts, a light knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Opening it, she found Victor standing there, holding a small frame containing one of his photographs. It was a portrait of her, taken on the hill with the windmill in the background, the sunlight illuminating her hair. He explained that he wanted to give her something that captured how he saw her, something she could keep. As she accepted the frame, Claire felt torn between joy and the weight of a decision she knew was forming. That evening, Claire walked alone to the pier, as she often did. The cool night wind seemed to clear her thoughts while amplifying her fears. She knew Victor might only ever be a fleeting presence in her life, but she also felt he was the only person who truly saw her. As she looked out at the dark horizon, she realized her life up to that point had been defined by choices made to please others. What if for once she chose for herself? The next day, Victor invited her on another walk. They strolled along a quiet path lined with trees, just beginning to show autumn's colors. Along the way, he spoke about his travels and the lessons each place had taught him. Yet it was clear that he saw in Claire a reason to stay. Even so, he didn't ask anything of her. His manner seemed to suggest that he understood great changes couldn't be forced. They could only be awakened. When they said goodbye that day, Claire felt herself standing on the edge of a choice that would change everything. She knew her family and fiancé wouldn't understand, but what weighed most heavily on her heart was the doubt. What if she was wrong? What if what she felt was nothing more than a fleeting illusion? Yet, as Victor disappeared into the distance, something inside her whispered that this was her moment to finally live for herself, even if it meant breaking all the rules that had bound her. Autumn arrived quietly in the village of Seaview, bringing with it the scent of fallen leaves and the golden glow of shorter afternoons. For Claire, however, the season carried an unexpected urgency. Victor had casually announced that he would be leaving in a few days to continue his photographic journey. He spoke of it as if it were inevitable, but to Claire, his words carried the weight of a farewell she wasn't ready to face. Something within her twisted between the desire to ask him to stay and the fear of seeming foolish for even considering it. The days leading up to Victor's departure were lived with an intensity Claire had never known. She cherished every moment spent with him, knowing that soon he would only be a memory. Together, they explored the hidden corners of the village, places Claire knew well, but now seemed new through Victor's eyes. He continued to photograph, but Claire noticed that the images captured more than just landscapes. They held fragments of moments that she feared could never be recreated. On the night before his departure, Victor asked Claire to meet him at the train station the next morning. He didn't explain why, but Claire knew she couldn't ignore the request. As she prepared that night, she wrestled with doubts and fears that haunted her. Was it wrong to go? Would she be betraying her responsibilities and the plans her family had made for her? Yet a stronger feeling pushed her forward, as though this was her only chance to say something her heart had been holding, even if she didn't yet know how to express it. When morning came, Claire was ready before dawn. The walk to the station felt longer than ever, her thoughts racing as fast as the trains that traveled those tracks. Upon arriving, she found Victor standing by his luggage, gazing at the rails with a serene expression that masked something deeper. He smiled when he saw her, a smile Claire knew she would carry in her memory for a long time. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Victor, with his usual calm, broke the silence. He thanked Claire for helping him rediscover something he thought he had lost: the ability to connect, not just with places but with people. He told her that, though he had to leave, the days spent in Seaview would remain the most precious of his journey. Claire's heart tightened as she listened, realizing she had perhaps meant more to him than she ever imagined. Before boarding, Victor handed her a small notebook. He explained that it was a travel journal, containing reflections and photographs he had never shared with anyone. It was a gift that carried not just memories, but a silent promise that, in some way, he would always be with her. With sincere eyes, Victor added, "If life separates us, let this remind you that you changed my view of everything." Claire, holding the notebook carefully, sensed that there was more to his farewell, a veiled hope of meeting again, though neither dared to say it aloud. As the train finally arrived, Claire felt as though time were moving too quickly. Victor stepped aboard, but before the doors closed, he made one last request. "If you feel the same way I do, meet me here, in this same place, a year from now." Claire didn't respond with words, but her gaze said everything. As the train pulled away, she stood on the platform, clutching the notebook to her chest. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, Claire felt she had the chance to make a choice that was truly her own. What she didn't know was that destiny had plans to test that promise. The train disappeared into the horizon, but the weight of its departure lingered within Claire like an echo. The days that followed were filled with an internal silence that seemed to occupy every corner of her life. Though she tried to focus on her lessons and her family's expectations, her heart was elsewhere. The small notebook Victor had given her rested on her bedside table, calling to her with an unspoken force. Yet she hesitated to open it, afraid of what she might find, a reality that would make his absence more present or impossible to forget. As the months unfolded, Claire struggled with a longing she didn't know how to articulate. Since childhood, she had learned to hide her emotions, to wear masks that pleased those around her. But Victor had stripped away some of those layers, exposing a vulnerability that both scared and thrilled her. Her days became a routine of pretense: polite smiles at social gatherings, measured words with her fiancé, and lonely nights spent replaying every moment she had shared with Victor. The promise made at the station felt as much a hope as a burden. One winter evening, Claire finally gave in to her curiosity. Sitting by the light of a lamp, she opened Victor's notebook. The first page bore a simple dedication: for Claire, who saw more than the lens ever could. The words touched her deeply, as if Victor were speaking to her directly. As she turned the pages, she found photographs of Seaview, each capturing a beauty she had never noticed before. There were also reflections written with raw honesty about life, time, and his search for something he had yet to name. Victor mentioned repeatedly how Seaview and Claire had reignited his courage to seek beyond the pain he carried from losing his sister. Reading the notebook brought Claire both comfort and a renewed unease. She began to question whether she was truly living or merely surviving. Victor's words, filled with passion and meaning, made her reconsider the choices she had accepted without resistance. Her fiancé, though kind and respectable, had never sparked the emotions Victor had stirred in her so quickly. Yet the thought of breaking away from what was expected of her seemed impossible, like trying to move a mountain with her hands. As winter turned to spring, Claire began to notice subtle changes within herself. Small acts of rebellion emerged: an early morning walk alone, a song played with more emotion than precision, a lingering gaze at the horizon while strolling along the pier. She didn't have answers to her questions, but she felt something growing inside her, a force she could no longer ignore. Victor's notebook became a constant companion, a reminder that she had a choice, even if she didn't yet know how to make it. As summer approached, Claire began to count the days. The promise to meet Victor at the station in a year became an anchor in her mind. She didn't know if he would return, or if she would still feel the same way, but something inside her refused to let go of that hope. At times, she doubted herself, but then she would remember Victor's gaze at the station, filled with a sincerity no one else had ever offered her. When summer finally arrived, Claire made her decision. For the first time in her life, she would follow her heart, even if it meant risking everything. The day of the promise was drawing near, and Claire knew that stepping onto that station platform would lead her to a crossroads. What she didn't know was whether Victor would be there, waiting for her. The uncertainty was overwhelming, but for the first time, Claire felt alive. not just existing but truly living. The promised day finally arrived, bringing with it a mix of nervousness and hope. Claire woke early, unable to rest, and spent hours preparing, though she knew no outfit or gesture could calm the storm in her heart. Victor's notebook lay in her bag like a silent talisman as she took the familiar path to the station. The summer sun, vibrant and warm, seemed to amplify every beat of her heart. One question echoed in her mind, simple but devastating. Would he be there? Upon arriving at the station, Claire found it almost deserted, with only a few scattered passengers and the occasional whisper of the wind across the tracks. Every second felt like an eternity as she waited. Her eyes scanned the platform, searching desperately for Victor's figure. But as the minutes passed, he did not appear. The silence around her grew deafening, and the promise that had sustained her hope for so long began to crumble. Slowly, a new thought emerged. What if he never came? Time seemed cruel, moving relentlessly forward as Claire stood frozen in place. She tried to explain his absence to herself. Perhaps a delay, perhaps some unavoidable change in plans. But the truth was harder to dismiss. She had pinned all her hopes on a moment that now felt increasingly unlikely. The platform, once imbued with meaning, now felt empty, leaving her alone with her thoughts. When the train came and went without any sign of Victor, Claire felt a pain she had never known before. It wasn't just his absence. It was the weight of everything she had projected onto their meeting. The promise that had connected them now felt like a distant memory, something that perhaps had never meant the same to him. What remained was doubt, an open wound she didn't know how to heal. Claire left the station with slow, heavy steps, feeling drained and defeated. The small village, once her sanctuary, now felt suffocating. Victor's notebook was still in her bag, but for the first time, she found it difficult to touch. It had become a symbol of something she had believed in, but that now felt like an illusion. As she walked back home, one question echoed in her mind. Why had she allowed someone to change her so profoundly? That night, Claire tried to return to her routine, but nothing felt the same. The piano, once her solace, seemed silent under her fingers. The familiar streets of the village were now mere shadows of a place that no longer welcomed her. Victor had left an indelible mark on her, one that could neither be erased nor seem to lead her anywhere. It was as if she were caught between two lives, the one she had left behind and the one she could never fully grasp. Despite the pain, something within Claire refused to give up entirely. She didn't know if Victor had chosen not to come, or if something had prevented him, but she felt their story wasn't yet finished. Even amid the disillusionment, a spark of hope remained. It was faint, nearly invisible, but enough to keep her moving forward. Claire knew that while she hadn't found the ending she hoped for, her journey was far from over. Summer gave way to autumn, bringing a quiet transformation within Claire. Despite her disappointment at the station, something profound had shifted inside her. For the first time, she began to seriously question the choices that had defined her life. The expectations of her family and fiancé, once unquestionable, now felt like invisible chains holding her back. Victor's absence was painful but also illuminating. He had planted a seed of courage within her that she could no longer ignore. Weeks passed slowly, but Claire found small ways to challenge her old routine. She began playing music she had always wanted to explore, unbothered by judgment. Her solitary walks became more frequent, often taking her to places she had visited with Victor. His memory was everywhere: the pier, the cafe, the hill where he had taken her photo. Each recollection brought a mix of longing and determination, as if he were still beside her, urging her onward. On one of these walks, Claire stumbled upon something unexpected. On the hill with the old windmill, she noticed an envelope caught in a nearby bush. It was weathered by time but still legible, her name written in Victor's handwriting. With trembling hands, she opened it to find a letter. In it, Victor explained that he had waited for her at the station, but had been forced to leave due to an emergency involving a family member. He expressed deep regret for not being able to stay, and a lingering doubt about whether she had come. The letter ended with a confession. "I still believe our meeting was no coincidence. If you feel the same, I know life will bring us back together." The letter brought tears to Claire's eyes, but also a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that, though Victor wasn't physically present, he had never truly left her life. His words reignited the spark that had begun to fade. Claire knew she couldn't continue living in limbo, trapped between her past and an uncertain future. She had to make a decision, not for Victor, but for herself. That evening, Claire did something she had never dared before. She ended her engagement. The conversation was painful and filled with emotion, but deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. Her fiancé, though surprised, accepted her decision with dignity, recognizing that Claire was pursuing something he could never provide. With that burden lifted, Claire felt a freedom she had never known. Small but significant changes followed. Claire began submitting her compositions to competitions and planning a trip outside Seaview, something she had always dreamed of, but never believed possible. The world, once so narrow, now seemed full of endless possibilities. Though Victor still held a special place in her mind, Claire understood that her journey no longer depended on his presence. He had been the catalyst, but the path forward was hers alone. By the time winter arrived, Claire looked at Seaview with fresh eyes. What once felt like a stifling place now seemed like a starting point, a solid foundation for the next chapters of her life. She knew the future was uncertain, and that Victor might never cross her path again. Yet this no longer frightened her. For the first time, Claire felt she was exactly where she needed to be, in peace with herself and ready for whatever lay ahead. Winter passed, and with the arrival of a new spring, Claire felt that her life had finally come full circle. With each passing season, she had rebuilt herself, finding in music and freedom a way to honor who she truly was. Yet Seaview continued to call her, not as a prison, but as the place where all her transformations had begun. Returning to the village, she found it as familiar as she had left it, but with an air of renewal that seemed to mirror her own inner changes. As Claire walked through the places she once knew so well, she rediscovered the memories she had left behind. The pier carried the weight of the choices she had made, while the cafe held the memory of the first day she saw Victor. Every corner of the village seemed to tell a story, and she realized that, in some way, her journey would always be intertwined with Seaview. But above all, it was the hill with the old windmill that called to her most strongly, the place where her life had irrevocably changed. On a clear afternoon, Claire walked to the pier. The sound of waves gently lapping against the pilings filled the air, and the horizon dissolved into hues of gold and blue. Sitting there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps behind her. Without turning immediately, she felt a strange sensation, as though past and present were about to converge. When she finally looked, she saw a man standing in the distance, his silhouette framed by the glow of the setting sun. As he approached, the years that had passed became irrelevant. It was Victor. He was older as she was, but the light in his eyes remained unchanged. He looked at her with a mix of surprise and recognition, as though standing before something he had longed to find but never dared to believe was truly there. Claire remained silent for a moment, but no words were necessary. Something in his presence filled the empty space left by time. Victor explained that he had returned to Seaview in search of something he had left behind. He mentioned that a recent photography exhibit featuring his work on Seaview had rekindled memories of their time together. "I took hundreds of photos after leaving here," he said, "but none of them captured what I found with you." He shared how life had taken him to many places, but Claire's influence had never faded. "Coming back was something I needed to do," he admitted, "even without knowing if you'd still be here." As the night began to fall, the two walked together along the beach, as they had so many years before. The wind carried the salty scent of the ocean, and the waves brushed their feet with a gentle rhythm, almost symbolic. Claire and Victor didn't speak of what might come next. They made no promises or plans. There was no need. Every step they took side by side seemed to reaffirm that, despite everything, they had found their way back to each other. In the shared silence, sitting by the sea, Claire and Victor allowed themselves to be enveloped by the moment. The horizon ahead was vast and uncertain, but the present was perfect in its simplicity. Time, once their enemy, now felt like an ally, a guardian that had guided them back to the place where they had always belonged. The ocean whispered softly, and the sun sank below the horizon as though offering them a new beginning, one that required no explanations, only presence and acceptance. The story of Claire and Victor reminds us that true love is not about perfection or ideal moments, but about the persistence to find one another, even when everything seems lost. Time, often seen as an enemy, can also be a careful guardian, preserving connections until the right moment. Just as Claire found her courage, and Victor kept his hope alive, perhaps this story inspires us to value the moments we have and never give up on those who truly matter. If this story touched your heart, remember that this channel is filled with equally beautiful and impactful stories. Subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our upcoming narratives, and turn on notifications to stay updated. Share this video with someone special so they too can connect with this message. And don't forget to explore the other videos on the channel. Each one is crafted with care to touch the hearts of those who watch. Thank you for joining us, and see you next time.